As you know, this is the fourth in 4 semesters of church history, and anyone who tries to do church history, even if you have 2 full semesters, which is a normal MDiv requirement, you are inevitably picking and choosing and having to be very selective. You just can't cover 2,000 years of history, and especially when it's just your poor pastor trying to do a Sunday school class. So as Christianity spreads and as various traditions develop along the way, I've had to choose mostly looking at the Western Church, though not trying to ignore the Eastern Church, and then mostly looking at Protestant Christianity, and then mostly looking at English-speaking Christianity, and mostly looking at Reformed Christianity. And yet, deliberately, I've wanted these 4 semesters not to simply be, here are our well-known heroes of the faith, but to really try to give some sense, imperfect as it is, some sense of the history of the church for 2,000 years, and not just our particular tribe. And so I wanted to do at least one lesson in this semester that tries to hit on global Christianity. And in order to do so, I thought maybe doing someone from sub-Saharan Africa, maybe someone from Latin America, someone from China, ended up, because of Presbyterian connections and personal interest, in choosing someone from Korea, the father of Protestantism in Korea. You have some pictures in front of you. So just to remind you, so first, mine's in color, yours isn't, but where is Korea? Well, you can see the bottom corner there. We're in East Asia. You can see Australia there to the south, northeastern peninsula off of China. You can see it also touches with Russia there in the very corner. Now, this is post-1948 when there was a North Korea and a South Korea. Everything we're talking about here is one Korea. And, surprising to many of us, the center of Protestant Christianity was in Pyongyang, now North Korea. And when they divided, with the Soviet zone in the north, an American zone, democratic zone in the south, 60% of Protestant Christians were in the north. And then over the years, you can imagine, they fled and they migrated, and most of them moved to the south. So that's what we're dealing with. We're looking at Korea. You see this on the back. I'm just going to be honest, I'm not positive who all of these people are, except that they are 7 early Korean pastors. I couldn't, my Google search image couldn't give me final confirmation. You'll learn that in 1907, the Presbyterian Church in Korea ordained their first 7 pastors. This may be those. I can't promise that it is. So I'd hate for anyone who has Korean background to tell me later, like I was showing, a picture of Abraham Lincoln and said it was George Washington or something. But that gives you a sense for they often would dress in white, 7 Korean pastors. You'll hear about the Pyongyang revival, a very famous revival in North Korea, now North Korea of all places. In fact, at my last church, we had Korean, well, we have Koreans here too, but a Korean PhD student, and he was studying some of the Pyongyang revival, and that was 1907, so this was 2007, the 100-year anniversary then, and there were many efforts by Christians and South Koreans in particular to try, in that 100-year anniversary, to try to bring some gospel back up to North Korea. This is the church where Seonju pastored. You can see, and then this picture is one picture of the inside, and you can see the person there. There were some Western missionaries, and that's, you can see by the suit standing up there in the whiter skin. It's one of the missionaries, but this was the church. It was about 2,000 people. It was a very large church. It was the largest church in the country, and then I didn't make a copy of it, but here in older age is the picture of Seonju. I apologize ahead of time, of course, for any poor pronunciations. I do have a number of Korean friends and one who's a Korean American and went and pastored in South Korea for a number of years. Now he's back in the States, and I tried to ask him at least a little help with some pronunciations and some books. I'm by no means an expert, but here are 3 things you could consider. A World History, Christianity in the 20th Century by Brian Stanley. He's a professor in Edinburgh, very fine global missions scholar. This is put out by Princeton. You can see it's a pretty hefty volume, but this is talking about Christianity in the 20th century all around the world. So there's a small section here on Korea, much more directly applicable, a history of Korean Christianity put out by Cambridge. So this is a standard academic work on the history of Korean Christianity. And at a more popular level, but maybe most edifying, Banner of Truth. This first came out in 1977. They have a little book, The Korean Pentecost and the Sufferings Which Followed, written by William Blair, who was just a young man at the time and a Western missionary, and one of 2 likely Westerners who were there as the Pyongyang revival broke out, and he wrote an account of it, and then the PCUSA published it in 1910, and then Bruce Hunt writes the second half of the book about the persecutions and sufferings which followed this revival. So we are talking this morning about Seonju. You'll find it spelled many different ways depending on the transliteration, sometimes spelled with a K, sometimes there's a hyphen, sometimes it's spelled more phonetically, but we'll go with Seonju. Normally, you will see Korean last names are first names, so the family name comes first. It's usually the shorter of the 2 names. The clan of which they were a part was very important, just like for any Scottish folks here, maybe very important. You have your tartan, you have your clan. You will recognize 3 Korean family names comprise about 50% of the Korean population. Park, Lee, Kim. Well, this is Seonju. Before we get to him and Korea, let's explain a little bit about the remarkable work of God in the 20th century in the global church. On June 13, 1910, there was a famous World Missionary Conference held in Edinburgh. Over 1,200 representatives from scores of mission societies met to hear reports, engage in debate, collaborate together for, quote, the evangelization of the world in this generation. That was the slogan of John R. Mott, an American evangelist, a leader of the YMCA. The YMCA in its origins was very explicitly Christian when it began. In fact, Seonju, one of the things he did was establish and lead the YMCA in Korea, which was an important Christian venture and also became a hub for pro-independence movement in Korea. You'll hear much more about that. Mott became the Nobel Prize winner in 1946. Now, this is many years before that. He is chairing the conference, and this audacious slogan, which came from the student volunteer movement, to see world evangelization in this generation. Wow, that's pretty audacious. And yet, at the start of the 20th century, it describes something of the Protestant optimism about the spread of Christianity. Christianity Today, which was formed post-World War II to be an evangelical magazine, it's a bit mixed these days, but that was a response to an older magazine by the mainline Protestants called The Christian Century, which is a very liberal, progressive publication today. But that name tells you something about how the mainline denominations were thinking of the 20th century. The Christian Century. This is going to be winner, winner, chicken dinner for the church. And in many ways, these 1,215 delegates gathered here were almost right. That is to say, their optimism proved to be true. Now, you can criticize the 1910 Edinburgh Conference for a number of things. You can criticize it, you might say, from the left. People on the left might say, well, what kind of world missions conference? You only had Protestants there. In what kind of world missions conference? Almost everyone was British or American. But they wanted to see the gospel fan out to the farthest reaches of the globe. From the right, you might criticize it and say, well, this was really the beginning of the ecumenical movement, which would yield some pretty mixed results and end up being rather indifferent to many core doctrines of the faith. But here at 1910, they were looking out on what they thought would be the Christian century. And in many ways, it was even more remarkable than they could have imagined. Consider some statistics. In 1800, around 1% of all Protestant Christians lived outside of Europe and North America. 1%. By 1900, that number had risen to 10%. Today, 2/3 of all Protestants live outside of Europe and North America. So 1800, 1%, 1900, 10%. Now, 66% of all Protestants live outside of Europe and North America. In 1900, the Christian population around the world, you could say northerners, roughly defined, outnumbered southerners by about 2.5 to 1. By 2050, those proportions will be almost exactly reversed, and southerners, global south, will outnumber northern Christians 2.5 to 1. There are, by generous estimates, we're talking about anyone who has some kind of designation as Christian. We don't think all of these are evangelical, born-again Christians, but the statisticians tell us there are 2.5 billion Christians in the world, and if you reduce that, that's a hard number to get a hold of, but if you reduced it to 100 people, so the global Christian population today represented in 100 people, 67 of them would live in Asia, Africa, Latin America, or Oceania. That's the global south. That means 33 would live Europe, North America. 65 of those 100 would live in an urban area, 35 in a rural area. Of those 100, 16 would speak Spanish as their first language. So any native Spanish speakers, good on you. Now, a lot of these people would also speak English, which is the lingua franca of our day, but 16 of them would have Spanish as their first language, 10 English as their first language, 8 Portuguese, 5 Russian, 3 Mandarin Chinese. Christianity has truly become a global religion. It is estimated that by 2050, let's just see what you can come up with. By 2050, which country will have the largest Christian community, the largest number of Christians by 2050? First one, just going to tell you, should be easy. No, the United States. Okay, easier. The United States. China is very hard to gauge the number of Christians that are in the country. What else after the United States? What country might be in the next top 5 by 2050? India is not, but they're close. What else did you say? Nigeria is on the list. Brazil. Indonesia is like 6. You're getting close. The list I have says the next 5 are Brazil, Mexico. So this is Protestant and Catholic. The Philippines, largely Catholic, Nigeria, and then Zaire, now the Democratic Republic of Congo. As of 2020, now if you deal with missions, we have Gary Corwin here among us who's an expert in these things, and others who have read this. These are familiar numbers to you, but for many of us, this might surprise you that as of 2020, Eastern Africa was 67% Christian. Middle Africa, 83% Christian. Southern Africa, 82% Christian. Now, the north, the desert, is Muslim, but sub-Saharan Africa is overwhelmingly Christian. There are more than 32 million Christians in Indonesia, 67 million Christians in India, as many as maybe 150 million Christians in China. More than 90% of Filipinos belong to Christian tradition, mostly Catholic. The percentage of Protestants in Brazil has more than doubled in the last 50 years, and the largest Protestant denomination in Brazil, Presbyterian, larger than the PCA. Similarly, the mainline Presbyterian church in Cameroon is twice the size of the PCA. I remember years ago having some native Cameroonians in our new members class and asking them to introduce themselves. And you familiar with Presbyterianism? Yeah, there's like 1 million of us in Cameroon. We're crushing it a lot more in Cameroon than you are in the United States. And in a 2021 poll, 17% of South Koreans identified as Protestant, and 2/3 of those were Presbyterians. So here's a remarkable statistic that I want to try to explain to you with the rest of this class. Here's the statistic. There are more Presbyterians in Korea, by far, than in any other country in the world. More Presbyterians in Korea than in any country in the world. And, I don't have the exact numbers on this, but the countries that send out the most missionaries, at least what I usually hear, are 3, the United States, Brazil, and South Korea. How did it happen that there are more Presbyterians in Korea than in any other country in the world when 135 years ago there were 0? How do you go from 0 to the most? Well, one of the answers in the Lord's providence is this man, Seonju. Seonju was born March 25, 1869. He grew up practicing Buddhism and an ascetic tradition influenced by Taoism, and he converted to Christianity in 1897. There's already a lot happening with Protestant Christianity by 1897. That's when he converted. Why did he convert? Well, there was personal tragedy in his life. Some say he lost most of his eyesight. He was reeling from a surprise Japanese military victory over China in the Korean Peninsula. We'll come back to that, but if you just look at that map, Korea was often a pawn back and forth between China and Japan and had really been under the rulership of China, and then what will come in is beginning in 1910 officially, but even before that, then Japan becomes a Japanese protectorate. It is annexed by Japan. He was reeling from that, and he turned to Christ. Here's connecting some dots with earlier lessons in the class. He converted by reading The Pilgrim's Progress. Years later, he would publish his own Korean version of the book, which he called, now do we have any Koreans in the class? I wish we did. So they're all in the other. We got Korean Presbyterians here, I'm sure of it, though. He called the book Overcoming Laziness. Now, that may strike us as funny, or even, as I know my Korean friends, they would say, well, that fits a bit with some Korean stereotypes, very focused, getting good grades, getting a good job, getting ahead in life. But Gil was trying to counter an accusation from some Japanese observers and some missionaries who said, well, the Koreans were not very hardworking. And as you'll hear, if there's one thing you cannot fault the Korean church for, and it's like any church, it has its imperfections, but not being devoted and hardworking is one of the things you cannot fault them for. And Gil refuted this allegation in spades in his own personal life. He initiated a daily exercise routine, like bodily exercise. He pioneered the now distinctive Korean practice of early morning prayer. He organized vigils, pilgrimages, periods of fasting and repentance. He launched campaigns against smoking and drinking and other perceived vices. He was one of the first graduates of the Presbyterian Seminary in Pyongyang. Then he became one of the first Koreans ordained as a Presbyterian minister. There were 7, and he was at the head of the list of those 7 initially ordained in the Presbyterian Church. He was the senior pastor at, Changdaihun Presbyterian Church in Pyongyang. This is where the Pyongyang revival broke out. You have a picture of it there in one of your handouts. He was instrumental in the revival, preaching, coordinating prayer meetings, organizing Bible studies, facilitating large gatherings. At an evening service, and we'll come back to this in just a bit, at the start of the revival, Gil felt the Holy Spirit was at work in the congregation, leading them into a season of repentance. That's what sparked the revival, personal and corporate repentance. And it triggered similar expressions of humility throughout the church, throughout the city, and then it spread all throughout Korea. That's what it was marked by, lots of prayer and personal and corporate repentance. At his church, almost 2,000 Christians committed themselves to a specific number of days of evangelism. I'm surprised Pastor Eric hasn't thought of this yet. He probably has. So people would commit how many days of evangelism in this next year? And it led to a total of 100,000 days of evangelism promised by Korean Christians in 1909 with a goal that 1 million souls would be won for Christ. He was the leading Presbyterian in Korea, arguably the most important indigenous Protestant, influential not just in shaping the church, but in shaping Korea's national identity. Beginning in 1910, so in 1910, Korea protectorate becomes a protectorate of Japan. It's essentially annexed by the Empire of Japan. And the Koreans, we'll say much more about this in just a second. Koreans saw Protestantism as one way to distinguish themselves from Japan, develop an identity of their own. Gil stressed Bible reading, personal and corporate prayer. He preached often in this period from the story of the Exodus. He called on God to rescue Korea under this, as they considered it, Japanese occupation, and called on Koreans to wait for God and to hear their prayers. American missionaries, this is it's amazing the things that the Lord uses in his providence. American missionaries were quick to point out the connection for 500 years, dating all the way back to the Middle Ages, the 1300s. Korea had been run by this dynasty. And the Japanese, I know you can't see this over here, the Japanese term, and of course I don't know Korean or Japanese, but was this, which American missionaries, you are a chosen people. This dynasty, which Japan rendered, sounded like Chosun, the American missionaries said, take that and run with it. You are a chosen people. So Gil Seonju in this time embraced this identity, saw themselves as a kind of chosen people, especially in that part of the world, who were many, now it's still a very small percentage of Korean, but like Israel, they were a chosen people who would be delivered by God from their oppressors if they were faithful and prayerful. Now we'll come back to Gil in a little bit when we circle back at the end, but I want to pause with his story and tell you about Korean Christianity in general and the movement for Korean independence so you can understand the part that Gil plays in it. Because against all normal expectations, evangelical Protestantism and Korean nationalism went hand in hand. There's never been a place, a moment in history where Christianity wasn't bound up with its own cultural moment, its own political moment. And the Lord uses that for good, and there's dangers, all of the above. But here, very unique in this part of the world. In the first half of the 20th century, in almost everywhere else in Asia, Christianity became associated with Western colonialism, boo, bad, archaic, backward thinking. And so Asian countries tended to develop a national identity in opposition to Christianity. Christianity was old-fashioned, Christianity was Western, Christianity was European or American, and the one country where the exact opposite was the case was in Korea. Now, for a long time, Korea was overlooked by Western powers and Western missionaries. There was a much more investment in China and Japan. Now, the growth of the church in China, you'd have to get to the other side of Mao and the Cultural Revolution. The last 50 years, the church in China has exploded. The church in Japan has never been more than 1% of the population. It's always been among the hardest soil in the world. We just had, I see Melanie here, we just had several people here go and visit some workers in Japan. So there are lots of Western interest in economic development in Japan and China and missionary, but Korea was largely forgotten. There was a peninsula there at the end of China, little reason to trade, little reason for religious or commercial investment. Catholics had established a small community of about 12,000 believers. But as late as 1873, with a population of 10.5 million, there were no Protestants as late as 1873. John Ross, now that should strike some, maybe have the Scots come in, they have, from Scotland's United Presbyterian Church, was one of the first Protestants to make contact in Korea. He was technically a missionary in Manchuria. Korea didn't allow missionaries. But he made two fateful decisions that would prove to be enormously fruitful over the next decades. One, Ross was committed, you've maybe heard this before, to the three-self missionary method. This meant he wanted new churches to be self-propagating, self-supporting, and self-governing. This was a new missionary method associated with a man named Nevius. The Nevius method, or the three-self method, as soon as possible. Now, this was new, that the aim was not for Western missionaries to stay there and run the church, but as soon as possible, that church would be self-propagating, self-supporting, self-governing. This allowed the Korean church to develop a Korean identity from the very beginning, that they saw this was their church. The second thing Ross did is he set out to learn the native language of Hangul instead of Mandarin Chinese. This was the language, the vernacular, the language of the common people. It was a script that had developed hundreds of years earlier, but it was considered by the Chinese and by elites to be rather primitive, backwater, the sort of thing that ordinary people spoke. And Ross asked if he could learn it. A merchant named Yi Yongcheng taught Ross this despised alphabet in secret. This was not a thing you did, so he learned it in secret. And in 1887, with the help of another missionary and some Korean locals, he published the Korean New Testament. It was the first Korean book to employ the Hangul script, the language used by ordinary people but thought uncouth by Chinese authorities. Now, both of these decisions, the three-self method and this Hangul script, helped Korean Christianity resonate with ordinary Koreans and form a kind of national identity that they associated with Protestants. Many of the earliest missionaries, I don't know if you're familiar with this word, were coal porters. A coal porter, this was both missionaries, Western and Korean. A coal porter is a peddler of religious books. So they go around, traveling salesmen, they sell religious books, religious tracts, Bibles. They also double as evangelists. Many of the early workers were coal porters. In 1878, two Korean brothers traveled to Manchuria in an effort to find buyers for their red ginseng. And when the older brother Su Song-ryeon, contracted typhoid fever. He was nursed back to health by the Scottish missionary who was in Manchuria, John Ross. He's nursed to health by John Ross and a fellow Scottish missionary, John McIntyre. And in the process, this man becomes a Christian. He's baptized by Ross. He returns to Korea as an evangelist, a coal porter. His younger brother, Su Seonju, also becomes a Christian. By 1884, they had won other Koreans to Christ and pastored a church in the village of Sorai in what is today North Korea. This was likely the first Protestant church in North Korea, so that this region became the cradle of Protestant Christianity in Korea. And importantly, think about this, and Koreans rightly took great pride in this. This was before, remember, they're traveling up north in Manchuria, and they come back down, and they establish a church. That means before missionaries were officially allowed in the country, Korean Protestants could boast of establishing their own church. So it does say something for the indigenous ownership from the very beginning. These Korean who became Protestants up north come down, start a church. It was always a Korean church. From the 1880s onward, Koreans linked Protestant Christianity with economic and political modernization. They thought their dependence on China was the source of their slow progress. So they were primed. They had a Confucian past, being influenced by China, and they looked and they said, wow, look at Japan is modernizing so much, and Japan has looked to the West, and we're still stuck with this Chinese Confucian past as they saw it. This is why we're just a backwoods place, and if we want to modernize and develop like others are, we need to shed this. And so where do we look? Where do they have the greatest economic development? They said, America. And they thought America was an example of an enlightened and prosperous nation. And further, they equated America with Protestant. Now later, as this develops, many of the Catholics who had been there first and had suffered, some of them had been martyred, but a small community, they want to say, time out, there are Catholics in America too, but the Protestants just, yeah, you're right, America, Protestant. So they thought of America as Protestant, and, it's interesting, they also understood America has separation of church and state. So if we align ourselves, they equated American, Protestant. So if we align ourselves with Protestant, that will seem less politically explosive, because we know that they have a separation of church and state. That's what Protestantism is about, they figured. There were also other forces bringing Korea and Protestantism together, and the sort of things you cannot plan. There was a PCUSA missionary, fast forwarding a few years now, named Horace Newton Allen, who was in Korea. 3 months after his arrival, there was an attempted coup against the palace led by pro-China conservatives. So there's a queen, and the queen's nephew was attacked in this coup, and Allen, the Presbyterian missionary, happened to be nearby and saved his life, which put Allen in good graces with the whole royal family, with the king and the queen, which allowed Allen and other Protestant missionaries to become close to the royal family and benefit from their protection and their support. Now, they already had some inroads because you have these Westerners, and missionaries were among the chief diplomatic channels. These are the only Westerners who are really here in the country. But this attempted coup, which failed, and the fact that an American missionary was there to help save the royal nephew's life helped to further cement goodwill. And Korean leaders saw friendship with the United States as a way to counterbalance other interests in the region. They looked around, well, there's French here, there's Russians, there's British interest. Kind of how can we stand out? And so they aligned themselves with America. There are other factors. Western hospitals proved superior to ancient Chinese healthcare methods. That was another reason Koreans said, well, see, we can't do the Chinese way. Look at the Western way. Protestants planted schools wherever they went, and the schools were open to anyone. The Catholics, though they had been there longer, were mainly French speakers, where Protestants spoke English, and English seemed like this was going to be the language of the future. If you spoke a European language other than English, you were seen as being old-fashioned, undemocratic. Catholic priests lived without families, of course. Priests are single men. In spiritual communes, they wore native clerical dress. Now, it's again, the Lord's providence. Some of these missionary methods that the Americans have, today we'd probably say, those really aren't very good methods. But in the Lord's providence, in Korea, it worked. They wore Western suits instead of native dress. Now, you can see those pictures there. They didn't make the Koreans wear Western suits, but they wore Western suits. We might say, well, you should really, Hudson Taylor and others, you should dress. But for the Koreans, I said, yeah, we are looking to the West for enlightenment, for freedom, for democracy. They also liked that the Americans, since they're not priests, they brought their families with them. And, that seemed attractive. The whole family's here. That resonates. And, again, this gets used by the Lord for good, and it has been used for ill. But they also looked, and it seemed to them, the American missionaries had access to an endless supply of money, which seemed better than these small communes. Now, they weren't thinking we're going to get rich, but it reinforced that Protestantism is Americanism, and America is free and democratic and prosperous, and things that they aspired to be. Didn't help that the Catholic services were in Latin, and that the Koreans had their services now in Hangul, the Protestants. So when they looked out, Catholic and Protestant looked to be two different religions. They spoke different languages. They had were all single, one were families, one wore suits. They were different. Catholics resented this, of course. They had been there longer. They had suffered. And they complained that Koreans were too influenced by America and had become proud of their connections to America. And all of this, and this book here on the history of Korean Christianity goes into lots of reasons, try to understand why Protestant Christianity took off in Korea. The use of Hangul was probably the most significant factor, that it resonated with the common people, and it was seen as a way to liberate Korea from their Chinese-dominated past. By the 1890s, Protestant churches were growing, multiplying. Almost immediately, missionaries and Korean leaders put in place very rigorous conditions for church membership. Women also served an important role in Korean churches. Christianity elevated their status significantly. For one thing, at baptism, it gave them a name, not just their husband's name, but their own name. Seonju went so far as to remove the literal curtain that divided men and women in the church service. So the men and the women could not see each other in the church service. Most churches, this was a sort of, there's a lot of debate in the PCA right now. What do we call women who are doing ministry? What's the best? Well, here's a pretty good, this is what they called them, Bible women. And every church had Bible women. These were often widows, single women. Sometimes they were wives who had been cast off by their husbands, and they played a pivotal role. They supported male church leadership. They organized educational efforts. They pulled churches together. Sometimes before there was a pastor, they were not very traditional gender roles, we would say. They did not see themselves as pastors for sure, but they would pull together Christians in an informal gathering until a male pastor could be installed. These Bible women, you read this history, every church had notable Bible women. In 1895, there was a war between China and Japan. Korea tried to fend off the increasing Japanese interference, but they also wanted to shed their Chinese past. In 1896, an organization was founded in Korea called the Independence Club, and it is what it sounds like. A man named Soo Jae-pil formed the Independence Club. Yoon Chi-ho was the first president. They wanted a self-reliant Korea, free from Chinese control, free from Japanese domination, built, this was important, on a modern nationalist conception that was closely tied to the West and to Protestant churches. Now, the government began to crack down on the clubs in 1898, which prompted many of those in the club who weren't Christians to become Christians. One of those converts was a man named Syngman Rhee. Syngman Rhee. From prison, he wrote pamphlets extolling the superiority of Christianity to Confucianism. He argued that an independent Korea should be founded on Protestant Christianity, that it would provide the cultural cohesion, it would be a unique identity among the rest of Asia, it would ensure freedom and equality. After his release from jail in 1904, this man, Rhee, traveled to the United States. He met Teddy Roosevelt, he met Woodrow Wilson, he received a doctorate from Princeton, and many years later, in 1948, he would become the first president of South Korea. The first president of South Korea was a Princeton graduate, just further cementing Presbyterian connections. As Japan's intentions toward Korea became clearer, so at first they thought, well, Japan won this war in 1895. We're sort of shedding China. Maybe Japan will be better. But then they came to see that Japanese did not treat them very well. And Christianity, at first, many Western nations, including America, they don't want to interfere, so they defended the treaty that was established. So there was some friction that Koreans said, wait a minute, we thought you Americans were on our side, and now you're recognizing the Japanese treaty after they won this war with China. But over time, more and more Christians and Westerners, even within Korea, aligned themselves with this independence movement. These Christians found in Presbyterianism an organizational scheme for a democratic self-government. They welcomed Protestant Christianity's emphasis on conversion, the conscience, and personal responsibility. They marveled that Christian medical facilities treated the rich and the poor alike, that Christian schools provided education for even outcasts and women. And Protestant churches became the engines of literacy throughout the country. One of the great examples is that verse in Titus talks about your good deeds adorning the gospel. These things are not the gospel. The gospel is a verbal declaration, but our good deeds, these hospitals, these schools, they did adorn the gospel to make it attractive. And once Koreans converted to Christianity, they were extremely loyal to their pastors, to their churches, to their faith. One Korean scholar said, it's a good line, Koreans tend to be, quote, ethical, spiritual overachievers. We might say once they were into Christianity, they were all in. So from the beginning, Korean Christianity focused on the Bible. It was Bible Christianity. And because they welcomed Western influence, so here's just the unique thing. So many other places, we're not sure we want Western influence. They were, yes, Western influence is good. So they were eager to learn Christian theology. And the Americans in Korea eventually came to be aligned, as the Korean Christians were, with this independence movement. Now let's talk about, as we come back to Gil, the Pyongyang revival. Everyone in studying Christian history should know about the Pyongyang revival. Again, now we hear Pyongyang and we just think North Korea, the most repressive state towards Christians. Well, Pyongyang was called the Jerusalem of Korea. Almost 20%. So I'm talking about all the Christian influence, but in much of this time, Protestants were maybe just 1% of the population, but in Pyongyang, they were 20%, much higher than anywhere else. There had been revivals in Wales, 1904, India in 1905. And this stirred the imagination and the different connections with missionaries that might there be a revival in Korea. These meetings saw people kneeling, bowing on the floor, praying all out loud at the same time, their separate prayers. Today, it's often just called Korean style of praying. Everyone out loud, just a cacophony, a wonderful, glorious cacophony of noise as everyone is out loud praying. In January 1907, this is when it began, 1,500 people arrived in Korea for their annual Bible classes. There were like an annual conference. You'd come and get your Bible classes. And they met, I erased it, and I'm not going to dare write it again, DeYoung Church, where Seonju was the pastor. And along with the missionaries, William Blair and Graham Lee, Gil led the men. The church was so full, the women met elsewhere in daily sessions of prayer and Bible study. One evening, men began to break down in tears, weeping, beating the floor, confessing their sins toward one another, and making restitution with each other. So when you hear confession, it's one thing to say, well, we all gather and we say, Lord, we confess the sins of our land, that we have abortion. That's true, but that's kind of safe if it's not your sin. They were confessing their own personal sins, seeking restitution with one another. Revival leaders traveled around the country facilitating this kind of meeting. It went on for days and then for weeks. Had the three main components: Bible study, prayer, restitution with confession. And it brought Koreans together from different backgrounds, kind of like the Great Awakening is often credited in America with laying the foundation for American independence. So this had a unifying effect on the nation. It was also important that, though this picture you have there, you can see the Western missionary. There are only two Western eyewitnesses to this first day of the event, William Blair and Graham Lee. But the revival was led almost exclusively by Koreans. This was not an imported phenomenon. And so, Christians, after taking the lead in this, they also took the lead in all sorts of efforts at Korean independence. They took a collection. Can you imagine doing this in the churches? They took a collection to pay off the Korean national debt. Now, we're not going to make that work. I don't care how rich the Episcopalians are. We're not going to get there. By September 1907, the National Presbyterian Church of Korea was established. They adopted some of the documents from the Presbyterian Church of India, along with the Westminster Confession. At the First Synod, 7 pastors received the first Presbyterian ordination in Korea. Gil was among them. He pastored the largest church in the country, a congregation of 2,500. In 1908, he baptized in one service 201 people, the first baptism service ever led by a Korean pastor. He encouraged the use of Korean architecture, Korean music, Korean art. So although there wasn't even a Korean nation per se, you could argue the first national Korean identity had been forged in the National Presbyterian Church. And even though Protestants were a little more than 1%, this was still much larger than China or Japan, and many of the elite political leaders were Protestants. In 1910, as I said, Korea became a protectorate of Japan. By 1919, Koreans had accumulated a long list of grievances against the Japanese. They lost their sovereignty, they were treated poorly, discriminated against, freedoms taken away. In response, students and religious leaders organized the March 1st, because it was held on March 1st, 1919, March 1st Independence Movement. Seonju and other church leaders supported the movement as long as they pursued nonviolent means. Gil was often walking this tightrope. Some Christians and just Koreans were eager to take up arms in a violent revolution. He said absolutely not, but he was a supporter of this independence movement. On February 1, an assistant Presbyterian pastor in China declared that Korea was independent. Korean students in Tokyo protested. A writer named Choi Nam-soon drafted a Declaration of Independence, which included some elements of Korean mythology that went back thousands of years. It did sort of graft on this 5,000-year mythological history of Korea onto Christianity, which proved to be problematic. But that declaration mainly echoed Western sentiments about equality and freedom, and the document was signed by 33 religious leaders, the most significant of which was Seonju. He's the John Witherspoon of Korea, you might say. And importantly, for history, 0 Catholics signed the document. Demonstrations kicked off on March 1st. They were so much larger, maybe between 1 and 2 million people, 10% or more of the population. That would be like 34 million people marching in the streets. The Japanese didn't know what to do with it. It caught them by surprise, and at first didn't do much, except on the first day in Pyongyang. That's where Seonju was. They cracked down immediately, gunned down protesters, many of whom were Christians. They forbade Christian churches from holding services the next day, which, this often happens, only galvanized a movement for independence and further cemented pro-independence and Protestant were connected. To suffer for your Christian faith and to suffer for Korean national sovereignty were overlapping categories. Japanese authorities regarded Christians as the main instigators in their resistance movement. They targeted them. In the years ahead, almost every pastor in Seoul and Pyongyang was imprisoned for some time, as were many other church workers. Churches and schools were destroyed. When the Presbyterian General Assembly, remember this is all 1919, when the Presbyterian General Assembly met in 1919, they found that most of their leading pastors were in jail. Many of their pastors were in jail, and this one hits close to home to me this year. The moderator was also in prison. Gil was in prison for 2.5 years. During his time in jail, it is said that he read the book of Revelation thousands of times. Not surprisingly, when he got out, he preached an apocalyptic message about the second coming of Christ. And he was sort of done with politics. He thought, Christ is coming back. The only way for Korean survival, national prosperity, is complete submission to God, and Jesus is going to have to do this. He resigned his pastorate at the church, the largest church, and he became a full-time evangelist, itinerant revivalist, and he remained a stalwart defender of conservative Christian doctrines, a proponent of Korean sovereignty, and later he became a very vocal opponent of socialism and communism. It is estimated he preached 17,000 sermons, which were heard by more than 400,000 people, and Seonju died November 26, 1935. Now, Korea became an independent nation when? 1945. Only when the Allies liberated the peninsula from, as the Koreans considered it, 35 years of Japanese colonial rule, 1910 to the end of World War II, 1945, and Korea has established its independence. In December, the nation was portioned off at the 38th parallel into a northern zone controlled by the Soviets, southern zone controlled by the Americans, even though 60% of the Christian population lived in the north. You can begin to understand the forgotten war in American history. Why did we fight the Korean War? You can hear with just this history why America would have been so invested in Korea. In 1948, the United States, working through the United Nations, called for, all right, Korea, you need to vote on your political future. They probably thought, well, they're going to vote for pro-democracy. And they would have, but the North refused to participate. So the South formed its own anti-communist government in Seoul. The first president, Syngman Rhee, Princeton graduate. They set up in the North a communist government in Pyongyang. Installed a communist guerrilla named Kim Il-sung as the first premier of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, though certainly not democratic. Today, South Korea, you all drive a car from South Korea, you have a TV from South Korea, you have a stove from South Korea, something. It's one of the most prosperous countries, one of the largest missionary sending countries in the world. North Korea is one of the poorest, most repressive, most persecuting countries. Which brings us back, as we close, to 1910 and the Edinburgh Missionary Conference. Mott, that American evangelist, in 1910 already, he held up Korea as one of the great success stories of Christianity. He said not only was Koreans being saved by the gospel, but their whole nation was collectively being strengthened by Protestant Christianity. He also lauded the Koreans. It wasn't just let's pat ourselves on the back. He lauded them for their steadfast commitment to Bible study, to prayer, to giving, to evangelism, to missions. Seonju also established this practice. If you were too poor to give a tithe to the church, you could commit and vow certain days of working or fasting or evangelism to the church. And Mott saw in Koreans many exemplary virtues. And in fact, as soon as the National Presbyterian Church had been established, they formed a board of foreign missions. Korean missionaries quickly spread out. Initially, they were ministering to the Korean diaspora. Where were Koreans? So they went to Russia, China, Japan, the Sandwich Islands, you know as Hawaii, and as far away as Mexico. And then they decided, well, if we're a real church, like the Western churches, we send out missionaries to non-Koreans. And as early as 1913, it's really remarkable. The Presbyterian Church established in 1907, already by 1903, they are sending out cross-cultural missionaries. Much has been written about why Christianity took off in Korea when it would take more generations in China and why it never has in Japan, even though both of those places received far greater missionary investment. And you can point to lots of explanations. I've mentioned some of them already. The use of Hangul, missionary policies which stress self-sufficiency, indigenous leadership, the use of Bible women and coal porters, the way schools and hospitals adorn the gospel, the affinities between Korean values and some emphases of evangelical Christianity, and then the way that Korean national identity merged with Protestantism and Presbyterianism in particular. But in the end, we simply have to say Koreans responded to the message of the gospel, and that when they did, the Koreans themselves built the Korean church. Of course, Jesus did through them. It's always the case that political, familial, cultural factors play a role. But the church grew because people devoted themselves to prayer, lots of prayer. This practice of early morning prayer, which is so deeply embedded in Korean Christianity, started from Seonju during the Pyongyang revival. My friend who pastored in Korea said, it is pretty much every day of the week, and it's very much an expectation that the pastors, at least, are there. Pastors are held in great esteem, revered, and also, to be fair, there are weaknesses to Christianity anywhere. It can be a sort of punishing, exhaustive kind of Christianity. But there are far worse things to be known for than being an extremely prayerful people. Korean Christianity faces challenges. Numbers have been declining, just like they have in the West. Pastors sometimes wield autocratic control. You'll see these churches that are hundreds of thousands of people. That's how big they are. Ordinary people can sometimes feel the weight of expectations of Korean culture. And, when you think of Korea today, most people don't think, Presbyterians. You think K-pop demon hunters. If you don't know that, ask your grandkids, because they're or you can ask Susanna DeYoung, who's 5, so just don't judge. Korean pop music, Korean fashion, economic prosperity, and I think one of the saddest things, by some measures, Korea has the lowest fertility rate of any country in the world. I asked my friend why. He just said it's a number of reinforcing factors that there's so much pressure on your kids to pass this test at an early age to get into this school, and your whole life is determined. And they can't imagine all of the effort that's required to do that for 2 kids, let alone more. But the church exists in Korea as a reminder, and just one example I wanted to give you of what God was doing around the world in the 20th century. When the Edinburgh Conference gathered in 1910, almost all Brits and Americans, Korea was already a success story, but not nearly the success story. I mean, think, they're in Edinburgh. This is the great triumph and tragedy of the last 120 years. Meeting in this grand hall of the Presbyterians in Edinburgh. Who could have imagined that the Presbyterian population in Korea would absolutely dwarf what's left of the Presbyterian population in Scotland with that rich history? You just don't know. The Lord will build his church, and we have to be faithful that he might continue to build it here. And if not, he'll take a lampstand here and he'll do it somewhere else. We see in the example of the Koreans what a commitment to prayer, evangelism, Bible reading, gospel preaching, self-sacrifice, that those are the things that the Lord continues to use when the fields are white unto harvest. Come back next week, and I promise you a very fascinating story with one Amy Simple McPherson. You won't want to miss it.